Okay, visiting St. Petersburg in the mid-2000s, I was asked by an elderly concierge if I had come to see the Tsarist palaces. No, I explained, I was there to look at the Khrushchevki, the standard prefabricated housing blocks built across the USSR in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Ah, but they are palaces in our hearts, she replied, a tear welling in her eye. These modest panel-built walk-ups, named after Khrushchev, have been invested with strong but varying emotion ever since they were built. A party decree of July 1957 launched an intensive program for mass industrialized construction of separate apartments for nuclear families. Standard blocks were set in large self-contained mikroraiony according to new urban planning principles, based on the integration of housing with services. Millions of new settlers relocated over the following decade from overcrowded communal apartments and barracks to separate apartments with modern conveniences. Today, in Putin's Russia, plans to demolish the Khrushchevki and to replace them with new luxury apartment blocks for those able to afford them have elicited passionate opposition from residents, along with highly emotional expressions of love and appreciation. Significantly, the defense of this Soviet material culture focuses less on private space of the separate apartments themselves than on the neighborhood, community, and the common semi-public space of the yard between blocks. The Guardian reports neighborhoods are well planned around park areas with children's playgrounds designed away from busy roads and noise. Contemporary accounts describe a place of peace and harmony, a garden with apple, cherry, and pear trees, and several playgrounds. Emphasizing their human scale, they depict a safe and harmonious space where children, nature, and human relations flourish. I feel safe here. I can see my children in the yard, says one resident. We leave our bikes at the bottom of the stairs, says another. She explains her attachment in terms of rights and choices. I have a right to stay in my neighborhood. I want to choose for myself where to live, in what kind of building, and so on. Got that one. The Khrushchevki have not always been celebrated as exemplars of modern urbanism, beauty, and social harmony, nor as opportunities to exercise choice. Western observers viewed them through Cold War lenses as the epitome of everything they thought wrong, both with state socialism and with modernist social housing. Monotonous, ugly, mean, and basic, these prefabs allegedly spoke of shortage, de-individualization, lack of choice, or of room for agency and participation, both in the material environment and in the social and public and political sphere. And they spoke of lack of care for the comfort of ordinary people, even as they provided them with housing at low rent. At the same time, critics conflated these low-rise walk-ups with the West's tower blocks and streets in the sky, blaming architecture for social malaises, alienation, vandalism, and neglect. According to historian Blair Rubel, within a decade, this view came to be shared by Soviet citizens, an assertion which this essay will contest. Should we dismiss the outpourings of love for the Khrushchevki today as mere nostalgia, a subjective and highly selective construction of the past as a paradise lost, with nothing useful to tell us about the past? While memory is always shaped by the present, we should also be wary of uncritically adopting Cold War prejudices that deny any possibility of popular buy-in to the Soviet project of socialist modernity and of faith in the utopia of social harmony and abundance. Nor should the hindsight of the Soviet Union's ultimate collapse occlude the complexities and possibilities of the late 1950s and early 1960s. As GDR historian Ina Merkel has argued, historians of state socialism must, quote, delve into the world of individual subjects, their longings, values, and possibilities for agency in concrete conditions. Combining analysis of authoritative contemporaneous representations in the Soviet media of the 1960s with archival records of local organizations and with oral history, this paper will seek those values, aspirations, and possibilities for agency that Merkel called for. It probes the historical origins of the emotional attachment to Khrushchevki in relation both to the actual built space and to discourses of socialist democracy, happiness, and care, which mediated them when they were first built and occupied. Over 70 semi-structured interviews conducted in the 2000s with individuals who had moved into new housing blocks in cities across the USSR in the early 1960s often elicited spontaneous accounts of participation and agency in the living environment, along with expressions of emotion such as joy, happiness, wonder, optimism, the feeling of modernity, and my main focus here, care. So care is a richly multivalent word in English, useful here because it refers to both affect and action, at once to a set of emotions and to deeds that are motivated by those emotions. The English word care encompasses both material and mental work, love and maintenance. To care for someone or something can mean both to like them and to look after them. It corresponds to several terms in Russian, but like the previous speaker, I will skip over some of my quotes, so I hope you will bear with me. So care is the opposite of indifference and neglect, the attitudes to which many of the shortcomings of housing, especially of its common semi-public spaces, have been ascribed in regard to Soviet housing, as to in accounts of social housing in the West. This paper will explore care in relation to architecture and democracy in the sense of participation in the built environment. Care is an essential ingredient in material practices of placemaking and in the appropriation of standard industrially produced housing as home, the affective, subjective element that makes the difference between living space and lived-in place. Care for the environment of public housing, I argue, motivated participatory urbanism, which in turn underpinned an incipient civil society and limited exercise of democracy at the most local level. In the discourse of the residents cited above, threatened with eviction today, participation, agency, control and choice, all essential qualities surely of democracy, played a prominent role in their affective relation to the built environment. The investment of human energy and concern, which the word care encapsulates, added emotional and cultural value to housing, transforming alienated structures into personal effects. Edward Casey, probing how space is made into place, observes that, quote, to have a culture is to inhabit a place sufficiently intensely to cultivate it, to be responsible for it, to respond to it, to attend to it caringly, end quote. So home is not only a lived-in place, but an intensively cultivated and cared-for place. But surely participation, agency, control and choice were highly problematic, both in relation to the Soviet polity and to social housing of the Khrushchev era. For Blair Rubel, following sociologist Nathan Glazer, such housing afforded no meaningful agency or participation, while others depict even the post-Stalin period as one of total state subjection, discipline and surveillance, greater even than under Stalin because it was dispersed and internalized. True, the affect-driven participation placemaking that I want to discuss sits on a low step of Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. The participatory democracy in question in this paper is limited, since it took place within physical structures and ideological parameters that represented the agency, interests and priorities of a range of experts and institutions, and it did little to challenge the macrostructures of power and domination. Nevertheless, I will offer evidence that grassroots activities in the neighbourhood, beginning in the Khrushchev era, provided opportunities for citizen agency and even a degree of input into local agendas and priorities, while at the same time building horizontal bonds, attachment to place and community. The motivating force was the set of emotions that I've called care. Care lay at the intersection of the party ideology of socialist democracy and the official programme for the transition to communism on one hand, with grassroots ideals for a better future on the other, invested in the aspiration to create gardens where children could play and grow. So I'm going to begin by setting out the historically specific conception of socialist democracy and popular participation propagated in authoritative Soviet discourse during the Khrushchev era. And I'll outline the architectural forms that were supposed to objectify the new post-Stalinist order and bring it about, so to organize people and space for socialist democracy. Presenting the 7-year economic plan It's not gone. That's right. Presenting the 7-year economic plan to the 21st Party Congress in February 1959, Khrushchev promised that it would ensure rising living standards and the development of Soviet democracy, of the activity and spontaneity of the broad popular masses in building communist society, and the expansion of the functions of social organization, in resolving governmental problems. The new Soviet socialist democracy entailed both material economic and socio-political inclusion. First, it promised democratic access to the benefits of progress, to higher living standards and abundance of material goods. An essential element of the pledge was to provide decent modern housing to the masses. Architecture was to be democratized and modernized, replaced by plain building, to better serve the needs of the people by making maximum use of industrial methods, standardization, technology, and new materials. Architectural design, along with urban planning and the construction industry, had an important part to play in fashioning the physical premises for this new post-Stalinist democracy, as well as symbolizing its values. They were envisaged as both an objectification of new social relations and as a means to bring them about, to promote and express socialist democracy by designing spaces to forge socialist subjectivity and organize people into a socialist democratic society in readiness for the transition to full communism. Even housing, while dictated by function, economy, and need, was much more than simply shelter. It was an expression of this ideology of socialist democracy and an emotive mobilizing tool widely represented in the media as a building site of the communist future, embodied particularly in children. Type plans, standard modules, and the demonstrative plainness of the exterior express the modernity and mass nature of this housing, the promise of availability to all as a mass entitlement. Second, Khrushchev's promise of socialist democracy placed new emphasis on participatory government, self-regulation, popular mobilization, and the growing importance of non-state and voluntary activity on a social basis. The state was to be transformed into a state of all the people in preparation for its eventual withering away and the transition to full communism. So the passage, this is Khrushchev, the passage of certain functions from state organs to social organizations will broaden and strengthen the political foundation of socialist society, ensuring the continued development of socialist democracy, end quote. One institution of the all-people state at the most local level of place of residence was the House Committee, or Dumkom, a revolutionary innovation of the 1920s, which was revived around 1960 in relation to the mass housing programme. The Dumkom was a voluntary body consisting of socially active residents elected by neighbours to represent each block and entrance. Conceived as an instrument of participatory government, self-regulation, and popular mobilization in preparation for the eventual withering away of the state, it worked in tandem with the Housing Management Office, or GEC, a professional administration with a paid staff, which included a party organization, which coordinated its work with party state priorities. More localized even than local government, the GEC was the party state's most immediate and intrusive embodiment in citizens' daily lives. Yet at the same time, the GEC and Dumkom, working together, were expected to mobilize and organize residents to perform socialism according to local ambitions and requirements, as Victor Buchli has put it. The voluntary social organizations promoted under Khrushchev have been understood as instruments of modern governmentality, inculcating self-discipline and internalization of hegemonic norms, and perfecting the grid of mutual surveillance. Indeed, they also included comrades' courts and voluntary vigilante brigades. However, we should consider not only what power prevented, but also what it produced. What new subjectivities, social relations, desires, and affects did it foster? Were such voluntary local bodies also a means to participate and exercise agency in the built environment and to shape it in accordance with self-determined priorities? And what role did care play in this? Khrushchev's regime has been called a mobilization regime, but paradoxically, a major part of its mobilization of citizens for the final push towards full communism was based on the promise of settling in the mikrorayon, An updated avatar of the new Soviet person, fit for these new times, was promoted, the new settler making home in the mikrorayon. The housing estate was envisaged as a nursery of the new utopian state of all the people in microcosm. Yet, if the organisation of the material environment structured consciousness and organised behaviour, as Soviet architects and ideologues believed, would the organisation of living space on the basis of separate apartments not inevitably engender petty bourgeois one-family mentalities? It was widely recognised that the new architectural and planning principles required discursive mediation to overcome the contradictions and to attach people emotionally to these unfamiliar places while mobilising them for the final construction of communism. Soviet architects held that people must be taught how to dwell in modernist housing, and Khrushchev also endorsed this view. Advice manuals, films, exhibitions, popular press all sought to teach new homemakers how to organise domestic space and everyday routines rationally, scientifically, and hygienically, proffering model contemporary interiors and scientific norms of how to do it. Magazines and exhibitions prescribed and modelled how new settlers should also feel about the new flats and surrounding semi-public terrain. This sentimental education emphasised two main sets of emotions. First, happiness, the wonder and joy of modernity, and second, care. So happy housewarming was depicted as the common, joyous experience of the age. The ritual of housewarming was an important narrative device because it marked the moment when big public promises were experienced by individuals in their everyday personal lives, thus mediating between mass and individual experience. Joy and gratitude for the gift of housing were also the predominant emotions of my informants when they moved to the new flats from overcrowded communal apartments, hostels and barracks. They recall their sense of wonder at the spaciousness of their new flat and their happiness, gratitude and disbelief at their good fortune. Many echo the sentiment of the concierge I cited at the beginning, that they were palaces in our hearts. Asked how she felt when she received her new apartment, one informant exclaims, "Lord, I still think to this day that I live like a queen." Sympathetic left-leaning foreign delegations visiting Moscow's experimental housing region and showcase for the construction campaign, Novye Cheremishki, in 1957 and 58, comprehended the ideological and affective meaning of housing as proof that in the USSR, the construction of communism was well underway. The president of the Polish Society of Urbanists, for example, expressed the emotional content. Cheremishki was not only an interesting technical experiment, but, quote, an experiment in the smile of the city and joy of life. We are sure that in such houses, in such living conditions, people will live better and will educate their children in an atmosphere of optimism. Simplicity of architectural forms, freedom of the spatial treatment, the cheerful lines of paths and flower beds creates in some a picture that is truly humane, a humanist living region whose main task is to make the everyday life of residents as happy as possible. And a delegation from the Netherlands Communist Party summed up their impressions. Above all, what strikes one is the great care that surrounds citizens of the Soviet Union. So care is the second normative emotional response which the media and other authoritative forms, for example, party meetings, endeavour to attach to housing. Care or concern were already in currency in Stalin-era discourse, where they referenced the leader's paternal, loving, but infantilizing embrace of the people. And it was invoked in a similar way in the Khrushchev era. As the well-briefed foreign delegates understood, housing and urbanism demonstrated the socialist state's great care for its citizens. However, there was a significant shift of emphasis in line with the move towards the withering away of the state, from a unidirectional gesture towards a reciprocal relationship, a kind of social contract. No longer was care something that the paternal state felt and did for its people, envisaged as supine in its cosy embrace. The people were now also required to repay the state's generosity by taking care of its gifts. This signified a change in the relationship between state and people, from predicates to agents, and from subjects to citizens, whose rights were matched by obligations. In addition to referencing loving solicitude, in the Thaw's climate of greater openness about problems and unfinished business, the more negative meaning of care was also in play, however, anxious concern. In oral history interviews, the move to a new flat was often recalled as an expression of great happiness, a dream come true, but also of worry. Cares were caused for occupants by the carelessness of the builders. Just skipping a little bit. Spaces for democracy are usually envisaged as public space, and we might expect the provision of spaces for sanctioned publicity, such as communal yards and red corners, to be a priority in the USSR, both because of its emphasis on collectivism and because the allocation or withholding of built space was potentially a powerful means of social and cultural control and mobilization. Yet the problem of public or semi-public space and the lack of interface between public and private were chronic problems that predated the new housing. Failure to provide such premises had social consequences. It left elements of the population, hooligans, vagrants, homeless children, outside of the collective or unorganized. Conversely, the provision of red corners was ascribed almost magical transformative effects on children and young people's behavior. Despite the rhetorical emphasis on collectivism and socialist community, the problem of public spaces for sanctioned gatherings and leisure was, if anything, worse, not better, in the new housing regions. The emphasis on maximum rationalization and economy of space and material drove architects to reduce or eliminate any spaces that were considered non-essential and that did not contribute to fulfilling the norm for living space. Moreover, the new residential regions were often located on the edges of cities, far from urban amenities. So a Moscow school teacher complained in 1961, quote, "The new housing stock is a disaster. The housing does not have rooms that can be converted into red corners." There were only cellars, but it was impossible to attract people to those, he went on. It's incomprehensible why they still do not plan in the new apartment houses rooms for red corners and such rooms where one can invite people and where it is pleasant to sit. The problem of community space in housing regions was particularly crucial in regard to young people and children. In the Khrushchev era, children and childhood took on great significance as symbols of progress and democratization and as personifications of the hope for the future. Universal access to what had once been an elite privilege, happy childhood as a distinct phase of life with its own separate spaces, was presented as symptomatic of how life was getting better for the entire country, proof positive of the state's care for all its people and their bright future. Official representations of the new housing often included images of children happily playing in playgrounds and fountains. Yet in practice, playgrounds exemplified the authorities' neglect of semi-public space in housing developments rather than their care. Children's playgrounds had been laid out in older housing stock before the onset of World War II, but had then been neglected or turned into vegetable gardens. So residents at a meeting in 1953 lamented that playgrounds had not been restored after the war. They were closed off or asphalted over, leaving children with nowhere to run about and play so that they had to hang around in stairwells. Though they lamented, apart from green spaces, we just need spaces for children to play ball. As with red corners, so too in regard to playgrounds, the situation was no better and even worse in the new housing as a result of contradictory principles and unintended consequences. The new urbanism had replaced small quarters enclosing a yard by a freer and more open relationship between housing blocks and the surrounding terrain. Apartment blocks were to stand separately, surrounded by fresh air, in landscape parks, with their orientation set to maximize and afford egalitarian access to sunlight. Openness was a functional, health-giving solution and an aesthetic principle identified as modern. It also symbolized the collectivist ideal of the communist way of life and socialist community. In the planner's imagination, the opening up of the yard would mitigate the hermeticism of separate apartments. Yet contradicting such aspirations, this open planning principle exacerbated the problem of public space. There was no longer an enclosed yard, merely unbuilt gaps between and around the blocks, undefined space or non-places. This presented further obstacles to the formation of a collective and of providing safe places for children to play and older people to sit. I'm going to try and skip a little bit there. So in the present day defences cited at the start of the paper, residents explained their deep attachment to the Khrushchevki by describing the environment as a pleasant and safe garden with fruit trees and children's playgrounds. And euphoric TV and press accounts in the early 1960s also celebrated the civilization of the wilderness on the margins of the city. But the garden didn't spring up overnight, nor was it simply provided to residents ready-made. Even the official media exposed the reality that the services, amenities and clubs promised as part of the Mikroraion principle often did not materialize. Landscaping, planting, installing benches and making children's playgrounds in the public space was left to private initiative and resources, decentralized grassroots organizations and collective self-help, and largely manual voluntary labor. Rather than waiting for the state and its central plan and succumbing to collective inaction, my informants described their voluntary participation in the process of caring for the common space, transforming it into home as an intensely cultivated place, as defined by Casey. So I propose that this care as action in the form of free voluntary labour played a part in embedding care as love, forming an emotional attachment to the built environment and with community, and at the same time in engendering a form of participation and, albeit limited, form of local environmental democracy. So I really don't have time to read out my quotes here, but I do need to give you a little bit of evidence for this assertion. So these are selected from a number of interviews, but statements that show that there is a connection between the sense of doing work on the yard, gardening, planting, and also building a community, building a sense of embeddedness socially. So many of them talk about planting the trees and caring for them, continuing to care for them, and watching them grow along with their children. They source the plants themselves. They often just dug the ditches manually. Sometimes the GEC would meet them on that and provide tools. So sometimes they talk about the mixture of official and unofficial contributions, official poplars and pioneer statues, combined with the fruit trees that the residents planted. And they emphasize all the time both that how amicable this was, but also that it was mobilized, motivated by care for the children, to create spaces for the children to play and to make special celebrations for the children. So I'm aware that I'm running out of time, so I'll draw this to a close by just stepping back from that, because I know it's quite a big assertion. And to claim this as a kind of participatory democracy, participatory urbanism, needs some qualifications, I think, that perhaps to fully count as a participatory democracy, you need to be able to affect distribution of budgets, the setting of agendas. And this is at a very small micro level of building social relations and of trying to actually exercise some sort of effect on the immediate local environment. However, there are also cases where it is clear that the actions, the collective actions of residents actually did manage to affect the agendas of the GEC, and that resources were put in the direction of supporting the activities that were initiated by grassroots community. So with that, I'll end, and I hope I'm on time. Thank you.